OPO7 has brought on a whole new level of success for the Blue Nami Mill, and when it comes to matchups like RP Law, yes, it is overwhelmingly negative for the matchup, but every other matchup that exists in the metagame is largely positive, especially if you're thinking about Lucci, you're thinking about matchups like NL, anything that really prays or has a decent matchup against RP Law, well, we're here to eat. So a lot of changes have come with it. With OPO7, we've moved away from Impel Down and Buggy for good, and we've moved into Gloriosa and the Kuja Pirates build. And with that has come changes in the characters that we play, leaving behind a character like Mr.1. Now let me know in the comment section down below, there's already going to be some players out there that are still on Mr.1. And if you are, how many copies are you playing of him? Because me personally, based on the list that we're playing, I don't think there is room for something like this, especially with the introduction of something like Perfume Femur. You're playing 4 more dead cards, which you then get rid of with something like Apis to help you dig for Gavls and Mr.1s and, or I should say, Rubber Bands and Kayas and Pilafs. So Mr.1 doesn't really have a spot. And so I wanted to walk through why. Why doesn't Mr.1 have that type of value anymore? I mean, obviously he's still good, and that's something I want to highlight as well. The power that Mr.1 has still in a world of Impel list down Nami, and why a card like this should always be available in your binder to pull back out should the meta change in OPO 8 and OPO 9, and we'll see how ultimately the ban list comes around and what deck goes to creep up to the top, because even when it comes to OPO 7, if Law gets banned in August, it's going to be a really long time for the West, which is the meta that I'm playing, to really catch up. So for now, let's talk about some Mr.1, a card that says on play up to 1 blue, add up to 1 blue event with the cost of 1 from your trash to your hand. So it can't be a cost of 0. You're not returning Gum Rains, and unfortunately, you're not able to get anything back for 2. Can you imagine if Mr.1 was on play and then you could return a cost of 2? I mean, we'd be returning Mellows, we'd be returning Snake Dances. There'd be a lot of value out of a card like this, but 1 is just good enough, especially with the 1k counter Impel Down. It was searchable by Buggy, which is why I wanted to highlight the whole Impel Down section of this. But the aspect of this that really gets played here is the fact that the card that it's looking to return is Gavl, giant Gavl here, that says 4/1 counter, you may trash 1 card from your hand and up to 1 of your leaders gain plus 4k, then you may trash 2 cards from the top of your deck. You can imagine as a Nami player, something like this is very valuable, and just going through 2 cards in your deck. So you spend 2 cards, you play Gavl, and you discard a card to go through 2 more cards. Doing this over and over again is really valuable, and this was much more valuable, especially in the Impel Down side of things, where you had the need for more cards in your hand during combat through cards like Deathwing. You were drawing a lot more on your opponent's turn and being less proactive. You're being more reactive. So cards like this had a lot more value, and especially in a deck that played a lot more characters. You played the Kayas, you played the Buggies, you played the Mr.1s. This thing's trigger, being able to return 1 character with a cost of 4 less to its owner's hand, was not only just an offensive mover to remove stuff like your opponent's Luccis or your opponent's Kuzans, but it also allowed you to return your Kayas, your own Mr.1s, your own Buggies, to get a Gavl back on the turn after and further set up for your Deathwing. And that's kind of the key here. That's the first loss that we get. Without the Impel Down package, we don't really have Deathwing. And a lot of players are playing a 1-of Deathwing. I'm a big fan of it myself. It's essentially there for the bluff. It's a discard, and it's a card that you can play around if you still have it at your deck to set up later on. But that's why Gavl was powerful, because you had those dead cards. You had to set up the Deathwing. You had to have a way to get rid of cards from your hand. And this was a great way to do it, because Gum Rains cost 0 to discard a card and give you a 3k boost. The 4k boost and discard 1 was very important here, because this also milled 2 cards, so it still actively kind of went through your deck. Gum Rain was very valuable, and that is what Mr.1 really proliferated there. If you wanted to set up Deathwing, you have to play Mr.1, because you have to recur Gavl, and that's where that idea comes from. But without Deathwing, you don't need a card like this, because we have something like Gloriosa to really move us through this game. And I've talked about this in a previous video, looking at the Dawn cost and the semantics of something like this. So Gloriosa 1 cost on play, look at the top 5 cards. It's a searcher, you get Amazon Lily or Kuja Pirates type card other than Gloriosa. And the card, so let's say for example, you play this for 1, you spend 1 Dawn, you draw a card. Let's say the card that you draw is then something like Margaret. So for 3 more Dawn, you can play the Margaret, you get a blocker, and on play you draw 1 card. No restriction whatsoever. You don't need to have 5 or less cards, you don't have to have 5 or more, whatever it might be. You just draw a card. So that essentially means for 4 Dawn, you Margaret for 1, Gloriosa for 1, Margaret for 3, you draw 2 cards. And when you compare that to something like Pilaf, Would you pay 4 Dawn to draw 2 cards? I think largely you would. You wouldn't do that all the time. You wouldn't do that like twice in a turn or anything like that, but that's pretty good every single turn if you were able to just draw 2 cards. And on top of the card that you draw on your turn, if you would just pay 4 Dawn, let's pretend the card you draw for a turn is free. It's something you get all the time. Imagine you just paid 4 Dawn to draw 3 cards every turn. I mean, you pay 3 Dawn to draw 3 cards every turn. Would you pay 4 to do that every turn? I mean, yeah, you would, which is why you already have this proactive passive value moving through your deck, drawing your cards. It's like you're already comparing and having the value that Mr.1 returning Gavl already does. Mr.1 returning Gavl is very card negative in terms of advantage, and that's why you did it only to enable a Deathwing. You Mr.1, which is 1 card, you Gavl, which is another, and then in order to use Gavl, you have to Gavl pitch another card. You essentially have to have 2 cards in hand there, right? You can't top deck Mr.1 and get a Gavl back, because then you would have to take a hit and then discard that card. I mean, Lord knows if that's a card that you even want to play, and then you don't even want to use the Gavl, right? So there's a lot of options that you get now in OPO7 that actually outdo the value, because you tend to be drawing an equal, if not more cards than you have been with something like Mr.1 Return Gavl. Now, obviously, this leaves up more room for getting got by other cards, because nowadays the card that a lot of folks aren't playing Gion anymore. Maybe the Blue Dofi decks are, but a lot of decks are actually playing Pudding, and Pudding is actually a really good counter against Nami right now. And it may not feel that way, but especially just forcing you to shuffle away your hand and essentially outdoing a lot of times a peel off or more. Pudding to get rid of a 7-card hand is so much value against Nami. Pudding to get rid of an 8, 9, astronomical. Pudding to get rid of 6 cards, not bad. If you feel like your opponent's setting up a good Nami hand, pudding to get rid of 5 could also be good value too. But in general, if you feel like they're setting up the bottom of their deck a lot, which we are now with the Searcher that we're using very actively, being able to grab Snake Dance, and then the Snake Dance can bounce the Gloriosa, grab that, and then you play the Gloriosa, grab Love Love Mellow. Like, there's a lot of setting up that you do at the bottom of your deck, so pudding erases that information as well. So there's a lot of things that a counter like that actually does, and so making sure that you have more proactive ways to draw cards instead of milling is actually more important now as well. And that's what Mr.1 again further proliferated, right? Like, it was a card that enabled you to mill cards, which you don't want in just the current metagame right now. You want to draw cards. It's about having resources, because your opponent's going to flood the board, your opponent's going to have better resources than you, better advantages, and so you want to make sure you have the cards and the angles you need to counter what your opponent's doing. Mr.1 doesn't do that. Gloriosa Margaret does, enabling a very similar situation to peel off, which is why a card like that just isn't that relevant right now. And honestly, I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just not good enough. Especially with cards like Brickfist going, we don't have as many bounce effects, because in OPO5 Nami, we all remember kind of back to when we were playing cards like this to bounce our Kayas and bounce our Buggies and bounce our Mr.1s. A card like this is gone, especially because the Buggy package is gone. We have so many more bounce effects, and those bounce effects happen on our opponent's turn, which means we give our opponent less information and we force them to think about more resources that we may or may not have. Brickfist was always a card I hated. I hated Brickfist for the longest time, and for many of you long-term viewers of the channel, you know that, because it was a card that really did nothing, right? Like, on your turn, you would have to bounce a character. It didn't mill any cards by itself. It just enabled you further. And I'm finding that now we have to play more cards that actually do things, that actually grab cards out. I don't want recursion. I want to draw a card and I want to mill a card. I don't know about you, but I don't care about the cards in my trash. I just care about what's in my deck, and I want to be able to go through that more and more. I would rather draw cards than mill cards, right? I think that's just objectively true. If you think that's wrong, you're playing the wrong archetype. Okay, at the end of the day, you want to be drawing cards, which is the same purpose, end game function as milling cards. You are getting cards out of your deck to win with Nami, but that way in hand you have more resources, because now we are not playing Deathwing. When we go back to playing Deathwing, yes, then I want to mill more cards, right? But we are not playing Impel down. We are not trying to reduce our hand size. We are not trying to win with Deathwings. We are trying to win with more proactive plays, with blockers, with the Kuja Pirates build, and with something like Snake Dance to further enable our searches to continue to draw cards, to continue to abuse Kaya's. something like Snake Dance is so much more powerful than something like Brickfist, and it further enables the cards that we want to take advantage of. Again, drawing cards is better than milling cards, especially in a world without Deathwing. Without the Impel Down package, we want to use the Kuja Pirates package. We want more resources available to us if a board, if an opponent, if a metagame is going to swing against us wider, build better, and just have more tricks up their sleeves just to take us down. And I think that's where I ultimately land with Mr.1. It's just not a card that I think has enough value. It does the right things. It's still playable, but it just doesn't make the cut. It's that last card that if you had a slot, which you don't, if you feel like you have extra slots in Nami, you're lying to yourself, right? If you had the extra slot, if you're just memeing around, or if you're trying something different for your LGS, sure. But when it comes to a competitive environment, I do not think Mr.1 is generally that valuable. But again, if you played it, I don't think you'd be losing too many games. I just don't know if you really benefit from playing this. I feel like this card should just be an Apis or a Gloriosa or another searchable target for your Gloriosa. Because at the end of the day, the basic package is still there. Pilafs, Kaya's, Rubber Band, Spot, like you know the basic package, but you got to make room for Gloriosa. And so a lot of people are upset that we're now playing Perfume Femurs, another dead card, to enable what? A plan with Apis? Look, the gameplay's on the channel. Y'all see me winning with it. Y'all see other people winning with it as well. Why are you forcing yourself to play Mr.1?